Okay, Philip, welcome back. It is a pleasure to have you as always. And this time, the pleasure is talking about Nathaniel Hawthorne, not just one of the great American authors, but funny enough, he's also the man born on the 4th of July.
Or on the 4th of July and a son of New England, where we are right now.
Yes, sir. So, let us get started with the man, the myth, the legend himself.
Nathaniel Hawthorne, he was born in Salem, and born on the 4th of July, 1804. He was born in Salem, partially raised in Salem, but he also spent a lot of his childhood in Maine, on a family plot. And for
So it looks like it goes all the way back, the tradition of people in Massachusetts spend all their free time in Maine.
spending time in Maine, and then coming back down and bouncing between various places in Massachusetts before going to Europe, but that's getting ahead of myself. Um, he grew up in New England, went to Bowdoin College, and made acquaintances with some future famous people. He was classmates with Franklin Pierce, who later became president. And he didn't have the best childhood. His father died when he was very, very young. His father was a sailor. Uh, and his father died of yellow fever in the Dutch East Indies, way on the other side of the planet. And when he died, this was a time when if the man of the house died, where did your money come from? Because, women typically did not have jobs that earned money. So how do you get your money? And he had to lean on his family had to lean on savings, and they racked up debts and leaned on family members. And it was actually his wealthier uncles who were able to pay for him to go to Bowdoin College. It didn't really matter too much though, because by his own admission, he didn't really pay a lot of attention to his studies. He was more interested in writing. He wanted to write stories. He didn't really care about Greek and Latin, and he didn't he didn't care about the subjects he was being taught in school. He had stories in him that he wanted to write, and so he started writing. And his first book was self-published. It was called Fanshawe. It was just a tragic romance, as a lot of stories were back then. And he himself footed the bill. He had to self-publish it, like a lot of artists nowadays. And part of what I find interesting about him is how his struggles at the time as an artist actually mirror a lot of things that artists have always had to deal with, and modern day artists also have to deal with. Um, he had to self-publish. It cost $100, which was not a small amount of money back then. That was quite a lot.
What would it have been along the lines of a year's pay?
It was a large amount of money. It would be probably roughly what a small printing run would cost someone today, which would be quite a lot of money. Definitely in the tens of thousands, I would say. Yeah, because my main frame of reference for um for exchange or inflation is the mid 1800s, which is more around 1840s, 1850s. And $500 back then was about like 15 grand by modern day standards. But it's also tough to say because when you talk about inflation, you're just talking purely about the value of money, but it doesn't talk about what money buys.
Okay. You're looking at roughly anywhere from 30,000 upward.
Right. So that would have been, yeah, so it's quite a bit.
Yeah.
And the book did not sell well. And he himself didn't really seem to like it that much. So he actually ended up burning the remaining unsold copies, which is very typically artist thing to do. He is we don't see him do anything so I didn't read about him doing anything so crazy and rash later on in his life, but it's definitely evidence that he was frustrated. And so he turned instead to writing short stories. He focused on short stories for like the next 10, 15 years. And he would publish them in, the New England Magazine. He would publish them in annuals. Back then, a lot of stories that people read didn't necessarily always come from the bookstore. People subscribed to magazines or they read papers, and those were places where you could read stories. Herman Melville, even when he wrote Moby Dick, it was first published uh, in a uh, in a serialized way. So there would be a chapter released every month, and people would wait to the next month of the editorial to read the next chapter in the story. So that's the kind of reading environment people had back then. Um, it was much easier to get a short story sold back at this time because there was a desire for them, but also people paid for the places where they were being printed. And he was well read, but he didn't make a lot of money at it. So he had to do what everybody has to do, which is get a job. And that's when he famously started working at the custom house. And he was earning, pretty decent living. They offered a salary. But he was frustrated because he didn't get as much time to write. He wanted more time for writing, but he also had to make sure that he made money. He fell in love with a woman named Sophia Peabody, who herself she was a painter, she was an illustrator. So they were both artistic, creative types of people. So with her, he started a family, and he started working at the Boston Custom House. That was his main way of supporting his family, because his big first success, his first novel success, was The Scarlet Letter, and that didn't come out till 1850. So between 1842, which is when he got married, around that was a long time. That was a good long amount of time for him to build up these feelings, because he was an author of great dark feelings, and he was also an author of obsessions. Um, and The Scarlet Letter, really, as the big main success, is the crystallization of a lot of themes that he had already built up over this time of writing all of his short stories, because a lot of his short stories had to do with colonial times. Nathaniel Hawthorne was deeply connected to colonial times, colonial America, uh, Salem's history, and the Puritans, because his ancestors were Puritan judges in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they were known for their severity. There was a father, I forgot his exact, it was his great grandfather who was a judge, but that man's son was one of the judges at the Salem witch trials. So you've got these, in terms of American history, he's got this deep familial connection, and this, but he also had this distaste for it. He hated the Puritans. He hated the Puritans, and he really hated his
I'm
ancestors.
pretty sure a lot of people don't know this about the Puritans. The name Puritan was actually an insult from back in England because of how strict their ways were. It wasn't what they actually called themselves. Even though they were called Puritans, they were some of the most god-awful, miserable human beings you ever met.
Yes, they absolutely were. They were severe, they were humorless,
I
they
think I
were
actually had
extremists.
in the first Christmas special I made. I think I had a slide that said over a painting that said Puritans banning fun because it was a sin.
They saw sin everywhere and in everything. They thought celebrating Christmas was a sin. They thought that they thought that jumping up and down on Sundays is a sin. They thought everything you can imagine practically was a sin, unless you were at church listening to a sermon from the right preacher, or you were reading the Bible in the correct way, or if you're just sitting in silence in your dark wooden house. That's pretty much it. That's pretty much the only thing you could get away with without being criticized for something. And people did not like them. People did not like the Puritans, and especially by the time of Nathaniel Hawthorne's days, the Puritans there was definitely a negative perception of the Puritans. Um, American Christianity had developed in different ways. American culture had progressed in many ways, and the Puritans were seen as this ver almost medieval holdover, like this anti-human, this inhuman group of religious extremists that punished everything. It was all about punishment and legalism. You have to follow the letter of the law. That, this is this kind of biblical concept, the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law that in the New Testament Jesus is said to have talked about.
Yeah. Um, to help give the idea of how extreme Puritans were, at least in the medieval period, serfs and peasants had at least about 100 something days off. Um, and all those feast days when they went to church, they had all sorts of fun activities going on, unlike the Puritans.
No, not like the Puritans. They didn't want feasts. They didn't want saints. They didn't want celebrations. All of these things were pagan or they were from the devil. They named them, they had crazy names for themselves too. Of course, they named themselves things like Joshua or Nathaniel or whatever. But they would also have these outlandish uber Christian names like, my name is God is Good Miller or G Jesus is my salvation Milton. They would have these long names, patience, chastity, prudence, virtues, these virtues that you wanted your children to have, and just remind yourself about God and Jesus and the Bible and sin and salvation is coming. It was very real to these people. These people lived it in the most extreme way. And especially by the 1800s, where you have the development of Romanticism, because that's what Nathaniel Hawthorne was a part of, this movement of Romanticism. Um, the Puritan approach to things did not jive.
Now, was this a period, because we have talked about how the spiritualism movement was a huge social tr revelation, where suddenly women get a voice. There's these whole new looks in spiritual arts and practices. Was Nathaniel Hawthorne a part of a period where people are now more capable of exploring themselves artistically or expressing themselves artistically?
Definitely. He definitely wasn't a part of the spiritualist movement per se, but this time period was a time when lots of new approaches to society and life and philosophy and theology were all starting to grow in America. Uh, you had Unitarianism, which is, well, that's a whole episode by itself. But you had Unitarianism, which is this great, all-encompassing, all are saved. God is in all of us. Unitarian Universalists still exist nowadays, but there's this it's a very new type of Christian derived spirituality that is deeply forgiving and deeply understanding of the individual and people. And the importance of the individual. And that's where romanticism comes in as well. Romanticism not only was a rejection of what it perceived as outdated religious principles with a focus on obedience, but it was also a rejection of technology because the first industrial revolution started in the end of the 1700s, early 1800s. There was this increasing mechanization, the creation of mills, um, steam-powered boats, forests being cut down for their logs to feed the furnaces of these machines, people gradually beginning to leave the countryside to go work in textile mills or whatever kind of mills, and leaving the placid, beautiful countryside, and agriculture, and the Enlightenment rational obsession with objectivity. And that's not, it doesn't matter how you feel or think. It matters what things are. Romanticism was a rejection of all these things. Romanticism said, my feelings are important. Feeling feelings is important. And expressing the feelings that I feel or that a fictional character feels is important. And that's a part of the aesthetic the aesthetic experience that I want to give people when I write. And so that's where romanticism comes from. It's romanticism comes from the subjective, the individual being important and the interior life of the individual being important. It's not whether someone fulfills their duties. It's not whether someone participates in society in the correct way or obeys laws the correct way. It matters what that person feels inside, how that person wants to fulfill themselves. Um, and that ultimately is the aesthetic and artistic movement that Nathaniel Hawthorne found himself being a part of.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So when we're looking at this new kind of, I hate to say it like this, but the first time of at least in a more modern context, men exploring their feelings.
Hmm.
Um, this is also creating a huge literature change, and uh, Mr. Hawthorne's now on the forefront of it.
Yes, because the things that he loved, the things that he you could say obsessed with, you could say interested in, any, the things that he, all of them kind of valid, are they are not rational things. He loved darkness and moodiness and atmosphere and curses and feelings of guilt and terror and suspense. You didn't have those in previous artistic movements, in previous literary movements. You didn't have the Gothic novel until the late 1700s, I think. The Castle of Otranto was probably, I think that was the first Gothic novel. And then, then further you got Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus, you got the works of Lord Byron, uh, and of course also Nathaniel Hawthorne. This was this first wave of dark gothy writing.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, and
and
it's not
this,
just in the sense of like kind of the natural morbidness that would have happened in previous years because of the level of violence and hardship life was faced, but to actually explore a dark side of the psyche.
yes, yes, because in previous times to express those kinds of feelings would be improper. Like, why would you write that? Why would you write that kind of that's not a book. That's not writing. Why are you spending so much time talking about feelings? You should be talking about objective facts, what does the lake look like? Well, the lake doesn't look like a dark sludgy pit to hell. That's not what it looks like. You're just expressing a bunch of, this. So but Romanticism said, yes, you can have an oppressive atmosphere and you can explore dark feelings because now we are in this realm where the subjective experience of something is considered important. And it caught on and it went well with Nathaniel Hawthorne's natural um,
Style.
natural style and his natural psychology because he was kind of a dark guy. He came from Salem, this city with this dark, violent history. His ancestors had a dark, violent history. And in the prologue to The Scarlet Letter, he writes about how he felt his family had been cursed. There was this idea that his family was cursed because of the misdeeds of his Puritan ancestors, who had sentenced people to excessive punishments, who had sentenced people to death, who sentenced the witches at the Salem trials to death in an unjust, it was unjust and he was consumed with this idea of being cursed because his uh, you know, his many of his family members had died, before their time. His father died before his time, and he had to grow up leaning on family for money. He did not come, to him, he didn't come from a great family. He didn't come from, his family had degraded and deteriorated from previous greatness. And he thought maybe it's because we were cursed, and maybe one day the curse will be lifted. And, because my ancestors, despite being so horrible. They were so important. They were judges and they figure largely in American history. But look at me. I'm just this measly little writer trying to scratch out a little novel in between jobs, in between shifts, weighing coal in Boston, So he clearly was consumed with this idea, with this oppressive feeling of being cursed and being weighed down with ancestral guilt. So that's why Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote this stuff because he was already obsessed with it. And it was his good luck that the early to mid 1800s were a time when people now were starting to get used to reading this stuff. They wanted to read more of it. Because I was talking about with my wife, uh, and we were about this subject, and Romanticism, and especially dark romanticism, Hawthorne's work and the works of people like him, allowed people to experience dark feelings vicariously in a safe way. In the same way that nowadays people, of course, watch horror movies to experience terror and fear and death in a safe way, true crime stories, same thing. We want to experience the drama and the terror and in a morbid way the excitement of these stories while being perfectly safe within our own homes. Romanticism allowed people to ex experience these feelings vicariously in a safe way. You know, they didn't have, their family wasn't living in a dying, crumbling castle and falling from mysterious illnesses brought on from sin or guilt, but they could read about that and they could experience the catharsis of that in a safe way. And they could also experience it in a way that didn't betray their religion, because America, especially at the time, was a very Christian country, and a lot of societal mores were dictated by what was permitted in Christianity, in an American Protestant Christian way, because Catholicism existed, but the Protestant um, especially in New England, the Protestant way of observing Christianity was dominant and still is. And Nathaniel Hawthorne could write these dark stories of guilt, but still in a very Christian context, because he wasn't an atheist. He wasn't like Lord Byron. Not saying that Lord Byron was necessarily an atheist, but he didn't write amoral, super dark stories where evil triumphs or where, in a world where God is dead, and he's not writing stories like that. He's writing stories in a very Christian context where these Christian ideas of sin and guilt and the fall from, in the Garden of Eden, and original sin, where all of these ideas are applied to fictional circumstances. And you can experience these dark emotions without being dark yourself. You can still be a Christian and an observant Christian and watch someone who commits a sin and is later punished horribly for it, and all of their descendants are punished horribly for it, and still think, but I'm still enjoying this from a biblical Christian perspective. And that's why this kind of literature took off. People had not had that outlet as much before, and now they could enjoy it.
Yeah, that's pretty remarkable. Um, Now that I think about it, it's like, huh, a whole different take on Christianity. So, other than the new and different writing that is now being broadcast into the mainstream of America, um, what about his history and his family?
Well, it's like people nowadays, it's a history of, having a job, losing a job, moving around, shacking up with, renting a room from somebody and just trying to keep yourselves keep yourselves going. Uh, he he had some successes and some lacks of success. He and part of it had to do with politics. I found this interesting too, is that so in nowadays we consider it kind of, it's not it's not it's called the spoils system in modern day, in classic kind of political terms, uh, where if you are in with somebody, in with a political figure or political party, that if that party wins an election, you'll be rewarded with a job. And we still see that, of course, nowadays, where presidents will give their friends posts, and they might be actually important posts, or they might be sinecure, which is basically a job that makes you money but doesn't really require much work, and so it's pretty much just it's essentially a bribe after the fact. Um, but Hawthorne was after he left the Custom House, he you know he published Scarlet Letter, which was somewhat successful, did bring in some money, uh, but he still needed a job. He soon needed to get another job, and he was up for the post. He actually got the post, I believe, of surveyor in Salem, Massachusetts, but he was a Democrat. And when the Whig candidate Zachary Taylor won the election, Hawthorne lost that job, and that was a bit of a blow. But later on, when his childhood friend, Franklin Pierce, um, he wrote a big piece in support of Franklin Pierce during the election. When Franklin Pierce won the election, he was rewarded with actually a really, really good post. Hawthorne was made one of the consuls to Great Britain. So he was put in a post of importance, with one of our main trading partners at the time, one of our main allies at the time. And part of that was he got to go live in England. So his family moved to England, and he worked as consul there. He was able to, vacation in Europe. He went to he took his family to Italy, and they traveled all around the countryside, which was it's a big deal to people now, but especially back then, Italy was very exotic, and the Mediterranean world and the crumbling art from Roman times. It was that figured very prominently in the Romantic imagination as well. Um, he was inspired on that trip to write another book called The Marble Faun, which was published in 1860, which shares qualities with his other works. It's not Puritan. It's not doesn't take place in Puritan times, um, but it does. But it does still have an aura of mystery and threatening darkness and symbolism and all that stuff. It actually, going back to earlier in his life, I want to make sure I don't skip over this because it also figures into part one of his only novels. He only wrote four finished novels. Uh, The Scarlet Letter, House of Seven Gables, uh, which were both Puritan colonial darkness, curses, ancestral curses, and guilt influenced. Then he also wrote a book called The Blithedale Romance, which was inspired early in his life when he had just met Sophia Peabody, his future wife, um, and she was involved with the Transcendentalist movement. And the Transcendentalists were akin to the Romantics. They were a little bit more they were a little bit more mystical. They were a little bit more hippies. They were very hippie-ish for the time. And there was an experimental commune that was run on transcendentalist principles that called Brook Farm, um, which is still around nowadays. Um, and his experiences there at this transcendentalist kind of commune where everyone is kind of working together, providing for one another, and dividing work up equally, ostensibly. Um, he saw a lot of contradictions in the practice of transcendentalism and communal utopian living, and his critique of how things actually run, he put into the Blithedale Romance. So it was there that he was also in contact with other folks. He was in contact um, with Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson. So yeah, so he was involved with a lot of different he lived a pretty interesting life for a guy that, grew up in the sleepy town of Salem, Massachusetts, sleepy at the time. Uh, he did move around a lot, and he traveled pretty widely.
Now, how was it for him as a person? Was he an interesting person? Was he a flat person? Was he a miserable human being?
I think he was pretty dark. I think he had dark thoughts. Um, he wasn't disliked though. I mean, people did like him. Um,
Mhm. Was he somebody he also sat around a lot of like he was friends with a lot of people who did shape history at the time too.
yes, he was. When he moved to when his family moved to Concord, he he knew the Alcotts, Amos Bronson Alcott, and of course his daughter Louisa May Alcott, famous in her own right as an author for Little Women. He also was in company of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. So it was these a lot of the luminaries of artistic and philosophical aesthetic life in New England at the time. And he was also in correspondence with Poe. Poe liked his writing a lot. He gave his 2 cents. Um, yeah, his writing definitely was dark, but he himself was not a person that turned people off from him. It wasn't the life of the party, I don't think. I think if you engage him in conversation, he definitely would talk about the things that he was chiefly interested in. But but I think that didn't that didn't frustrate the people around him because the people that were around him were people who were interested in that kind of stuff. He wasn't always surrounded by people who had no taste for it. He was surrounded by people who could appreciate what he was putting out.
Well, that's good. Um, is there anything else you'd like to cover, Philip?
Not really. I guess to sum up, Nathaniel Hawthorne was a man who felt very deeply and darkly and had things that preoccupied him, like many of us do, if not all of us. And he came around at a time when there was taste for stories like that. And he did find some success, but like with everybody, he had his ups and downs. And it was good luck for him that he had found that time, because if he had been born any earlier, it would have been very difficult for him to find any success as a writer, and we might not know about him.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So thank you again, Philip. It's a pleasure as always.
You're welcome.